My name is John Yoon, as mentioned, and let me go ahead and introduce our distinguished panelist. Here with me is Maureen Olhausen, who is a partner and chair of the Global Antitrust and Competition Law Practice Group at Baker Botts, and a former acting chairman and commissioner at the U.S. Federal Trade Commission. Joining us virtually is Dr. David Teese, who is the Thomas W. Tuscher Professor in Global Business at the University of California, Berkeley Haas School of Business, and faculty director at the Tuscher Center for the Management of Intellectual Capital. So we have a true hybrid panel here for you today, and we're going to cover a number of what I think will be very interesting topics. And so the way we're going to structure it is, I think David's going to go ahead and have a presentation with some slides for about 20 minutes, and then we'll switch over to Maureen, who has a presentation, and she'll go for about 15, and then we'll move into really a question and answer session. Please feel free to have your questions ready, and we'll just integrate it with the panel's Q&A that we have planned, and hopefully we'll have a very lively discussion. So with that, as soon as David is ready, we'll go ahead and get started. So,
okay, David. I'm ready, Josh. Thank you very much. Well, we've been tasked to discuss global differences in the treatment of SEPs and SSOs, and I have a little slide presentation that begins with a background here. The first point is to discuss, well, what is all of this standards development about? And I'm not going to apologize for spending 2 minutes on this, because I think policymakers don't really understand very well what standards development is all about. If I can turn now to the first slide, the goals of standards development is to build a robust ecosystem for mobile wireless and, of course, the Internet of Things. And we're talking about standards development on a global scale. So what we have with 3GPP and with ETSI, the European Telecommunications Standards Institute, is essentially, I would say, close to an organizational miracle. It is a kind of loose strategic alliance or consortium, if you will, amongst the global producers of wireless technology. When you think about it, there is no other global research and development arrangement of this scale and this importance. There's never been in human history before. It was almost destroyed by our own Federal Trade Commission, who walked in not really understanding the global system of standards development and how it enabled firms to work together to produce important technologies for the future. So the reason I simply dwell on it is that if you're fashioning antitrust policy and intellectual property policy, you have to be aware that what's behind it is actually quite a fragile system of global cooperation. And particularly in today's world, where there's increasing stress on international issues, it's most important that we understand that what we have here is something very special that has been around now for almost 30 years and has resulted in the development of enabling technologies and the combination of enabling technologies and the standardization of enabling technologies, which have produced the mobile wireless revolution and which are now going to support the Internet of Things. So that's just my little preamble here, that we have a very unusual consensus-based, nonlinear system of cooperation where individual companies in nation states come together in a collective mantle to produce wireless technologies, standardized wireless technologies for the future. And it's about standardization on the best technologies that will ultimately benefit consumers and societies. Next slide, please. We'll move to the next slide. All right. I think I've more or less covered this point. But when I say fragility, I mean that there is an alternative model that you can imagine here, which is that all of this is done in a vertically integrated fashion. So for this global system to work, it enables specialization, modularization, and what in the management literature is referred to as open innovation. And by open innovation, we don't mean that there isn't intellectual property involved. There is, but it means that companies are willing to license their technologies both outwardly and inwardly. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, as I've said, this system is under threat. It survived by a whisker the efforts of the Federal Trade Commission using antitrust in the Qualcomm case. What I don't think anyone in the Federal Trade Commission deeply understood is that had they succeeded in their efforts and in their antitrust case, they would have blown up this global consortium. So it's under threat from antitrust. But as the Swedish Institute for International Affairs points out, it's also under threat by strategic behavior from China. And just to read what they say is for decades, and almost unnoticed by the general public and politicians, technical standards have been a driving engine behind globalization. They now run the risk of turning into a core subject of great power competition over high technology. Europe emphasizes its commitment to rules-based institution in world affairs. So the 3GPP ETSI has survived the Federal Trade Commission, almost destroying it. The question now is, will China destroy it through pursuing national self-interest and trying to shape standards to develop a national agenda, or at least to support a national agenda? This is primarily a corporate effort up till today. Standards development has been individual companies cooperating, essentially independent of their country of origin. There's been no coordination by the United States or Europe to, quote, get a European set of standards accepted by the world, or, quote, to get an American set of standards involved. It's been driven by corporations trying to get the best technologies involved. Yes, of course, there's been commercial purpose, but it's been uncoupled from national interest. But as I point out in this slide, and I'm simply quoting others here, the CCP has seized on the importance of standards development bodies for the dual and mutually reinforcing objective of increasing national competitiveness and building international influence on technology adoption. So this is merely to underscore that on the one hand, the system has been under threat by clumsy actions by Western nations, particularly the United States, and particularly the United States Federal Trade Commission. Fortunately, because of the decision of the Ninth Circuit Appeals Court, this clumsy effort did not succeed, and we still have a global system that's open and flourishing. But the question now is, will it survive Chinese strategic behavior? Or one might frame it this way: the antitrust issues have not fully gone away, and will it survive another potential antitrust attack? Next slide, please. Just to finally sort of drive home the fragility of this issue and the amazing nature of it, and I say this as an organizational economist, as a professor of international business, as someone who studied organizations at the individual firm level and at the national level. The way this whole thing works is because the companies that contribute their technologies, when I say contribute, this is not a donation as such. It's putting forward technologies that will be, that are typically protected by patents, but agreeing to license those technologies on fair and reasonable and non-discriminatory terms. So the companies provide technology, but enter into a contract with ETSI and implementers are third-party beneficiaries of those contracts. So this is once again, and I'm not a lawyer, but this is an amazing circumstance of decentralized global governance, all held together, or at least underscored or underpinned by contract law, and no big bureaucracy, no political interference as such. I just want you to fully appreciate, because almost there's not a single scholar that I'm aware of that has really picked up on this and made much of it. And as a result, policymakers are walking around half blind when they deal with licensing issues and when they deal with antitrust issues. Next slide, please. So while I said at one level it's supported by contract law, French law, at the other level it also depends on individual jurisdictions around the world being willing to support the patent system. So yes, French law is the key enabler, if you will, from a governance point of view, but we also require the courts to understand what this is all about and to support it. And there's actually some good news here. It turns out the courts are, I think, a bit more adept than government agencies, and they do recognize that this licensing model is fragile, that licensing of standards essential patents has to be done on a portfolio basis. You can't pick and choose, and that it's typically and necessarily a global license that is required. And supporting that is important to minimize transactions costs and to enable a relatively efficient market for know-how. Notwithstanding that, there are implementers around the world that would prefer to have something for free rather than pay for it, and that's not a new phenomenon. And so we need the courts to prevent free riding, if you will. And also, you need the courts to make sure that the providers of technology are, in fact, sticking to the contract to provide the access to their technologies on a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. But the biggest challenge to the open innovation model is antitrust, in my view. Clearly, contract law undergirds it all, and it worked very, very well until antitrust stuck its nose in where, in my view, as an international economist and as an organizational economist, it didn't belong. Next slide, please. And by the way, most of the courts now agree with that. Next slide, please. So I point out here that while national laws are imperfect, I would say on the one hand, it's amazing this thing works at all. So perfection is perhaps too high a standard. There are two landmark cases which have helped immensely in terms of the maintenance of this global engine of innovation. One is Unwired Planet in the UK, which did a number of positive things, including underscoring that global portfolio licensing is the industry standard, and that the FRAND range, or that FRAND is actually a range of royalties. It doesn't have to be a specific royalty. And as I mentioned before, Ftc versus Qualcomm, where after looking very hard at these issues, Qualcomm, the court of the Ninth Circuit basically supported Qualcomm's licensing model and essentially dismissed the antitrust cases, did not see royalties as a tax, but they saw royalties as the essential fuel to keep the engine of innovation going. So there is actually some good news, and when folks, when policymakers and when courts look very closely at this, and you have very smart decision makers and adjudicators, there's a greater chance that things will be done the right way. And fortunately for all of us, and for global industry and for global cooperation, these two cases here, and there's many others, have come now to support this basic system that I've said from the beginning is really quite amazing. Next slide, please. That said, let's talk about some of the issues that take place at a national jurisdictional level and talk about some of the problems that are there and that could potentially tip it all over again. Injunctive relief in the United States has been pulled back considerably. The United States used to be a place where, patents were respected, or at least for 25, 30 years. The United States, since the early 80s, patents were respected, but in fact, injunctive relief is very hard to get. And anybody who's thought about it for a few minutes will recognize that if you don't have injunctive relief, it's very hard, since this is patents, it's not trade secrets. With trade secrets, you can take them away, or at least you can keep them to yourself. But if you've got patented technology and it's out there anyway, there's an awful temptation for people to use the technology. Don't even say thank you very much, but not be willing to pay for it. So we need courts to support injunctive relief. I just simply point out in this slide that the high watermark for the movement to use antitrust to limit injunctive relief, in fact, to negate injunctive relief, was the IEEE's 2015 patent policy, which the DOJ in a business review letter first supported, and then Makin Dilrahim rightfully changed the direction of the DOJ on that. But now we see some backsliding in May of this year, with the DOJ saying that this was advocacy rather than guidance. Once again, Federal Trade Commission, or the DOJ in this case, not really understanding the fragility of the global system. The champions supposedly of competition, well, if you're champions of competition, then you're champions of open innovation, and you're champions of having this system work. But apparently not so anymore. Next slide, please. The result is that the EU actually has displaced the United States, at least giving a little bit more opportunity for injunctive relief. You might even find companies like Brazil doing a better job with respect to enforcing patents and preventing free riding. I just simply point out in this slide that the Huawei's ETE framework gives a little bit of support for injunctive relief, and throwing cold water on what we call the holdout problem, where licensees are reluctant, in fact, unwilling to play their role in keeping the system going. So there's three big enemies, in my view, of the open innovation system. One is antitrust. Second one is strategic behavior from China. And the third one, which has been there, is implementers, which is a growing number that try to use a court system to get something for nothing, or for close to nothing. So that's where we are on injunctive relief. Next slide, please. China, it's very hard to read, at least for me to read, exactly where China's at on injunctive relief. There is some precedent for providing injunctive relief where there has been bad faith negotiation, although that's obviously a very slippery concept. There's always fear, very hard to really figure this out, but there's fear, at least, that there's discrimination in the way the courts deal with these issues as between domestic and foreign firms. So I would say the Chinese record is no better, no worse than the United States, perhaps, in creating a certain amount of ambiguity. And maybe Europe's a slight whisker ahead in terms of being willing to provide the injunctive relief that's necessary to support the system, so that it doesn't fall by weight of the difficulties of getting a global licensing program implemented. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done here. On damages, some economists are shockingly of the belief that, well, so long as there's ultimately damages paid, then who cares? And the reason why you care is because if you just simply don't have any form of injunctive relief, and and as an implementer can negotiate in the courtroom rather than in the marketplace, you're going to both clog the courts and lead and create deep inefficiencies in the system. So, of course, damages tend to be limited to national boundaries. But what we need is a system that doesn't give the holdouts the right to pay and say, catch me if you can, and meet in court and pay no more than they would have paid anyway. Next slide, please. Then another big question is the freedom of the owners of intellectual property and the contributors of technology to set their own licensing model in terms of the stage of industry in which they license. And there seems to be, fortunately, global convergence that patent owners can license at whatever level of the industry they so choose, be it at the device level, be it at the chip level, be it at the subassembly level. So there's been at least a reasonable appreciation of the need to have flexibility with respect to licensing models, although this is an issue, particularly the IoT, that's always coming back. Next slide, please. Or should I say it's coming back and never gone away. So what are my concluding observations here? My concluding observations is that system that was working very well is still working well. Antitrust, in my view, almost killed it. And there's always a danger that antitrust will kill the system again. And I think as academics, we've got some culpability here. A lot of the antitrust intervention was driven by so-called hold-up theories, which came from my good friend, our Nobel laureate, Oliver Williamson, who, by the way, when he introduced this concept of hold-up to the economic literature, was not talking about intellectual property. He was talking about physical property. And with intellectual property, of course, in particular with patents, they're not self-enforcing. But some economists took this notion, and as economists, we love to find cute theories, and this sold very well and created a lot of confusion, and it transferred from the American university to the European universities and then into Asia, and had a significant impact on antitrust enforcement. A very unfortunate case of misreading of a theory and misapplication of a theory. So as academics, you can have impact, and no question about it, but often it's negative, and often it's perhaps unintentional. But we have a social responsibility ourselves to make sure that if we're going to put forward theories, that we have evidence behind them first. And there's been no one has ever published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal showing evidence of holdup, but nevertheless, the holdup idea has animated antitrust policy in many jurisdictions. And one concluding slide, next slide, please. I'll leave you with a remark from Makin Darahim, where he says, with an eye to promoting dynamic competition, I humbly submit that competition law enforcers around the world must give careful consideration to the interests that drive innovation, including by allowing innovators to reap the full rewards of their investment in research and development. Put in my words, if antitrust can become a champion of innovation rather than the enemy of innovation, as it often is, then I think antitrust will support the system of global innovation. But to get there, antitrust has to favor dynamic competition over static competition. So that's part of my professional and academic and research mission, is to develop the dynamic competition paradigm. Then the global system of innovation has a better chance of surviving. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's amazing how much you pack into your presentation. There's a lot to think about. But before we do that, I want to turn it over to Maureen and give her a chance to have her presentation.
Great. Thanks so much, John. And thank you to David for that wonderful and comprehensive presentation, which leaves me in the ticklish spot of what else is there to say on, on this topic, particularly looking at all the wonderful panels that have already gone before. So I think what would may be most interesting and most useful, because I'm not sure I can add a whole lot to all the brilliant things that have already been said, is to do a little bit of forecasting. And, look, having been at the FTC, I'm sure you're all well aware of my dissent in Qualcomm and, all the ups and downs of that case and some of the other issues that were certainly hot and playing out while I was at the FTC. Obviously as a keen observer of also, what happened during the rest of the Trump administration, I think it might be most interesting to say, okay, what do I see in the cards going forward? So in the current administration, as you may be aware, President Biden has issued this executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. And it's kind of this whole of government approach to competition. And it's given the FTC or suggested that the FTC should undertake many tasks. Also DOJ, and a host of other agencies. One of the things that particularly stood out for me in this space is the EO questioned whether the 2019 policy statement on remedies for SEPs subject to voluntary FRAND commitments should be revised, right? So this is the one that under Macon Delrahim's leadership, these interpretations of a previous statement that could have led some people astray were clarified. So as I think David already noted, when the division issued the 2019 remedy statement and withdrew the 2013 statement, it shifted policy to a more IP-friendly approach and explained that in its view, the previous 2013 statement had been misinterpreted in a number of ways that could hurt incentives to invest in technology and distort FRAND negotiations. And the real impact or the real message of the 2019 remedy statement was to make clear there were no special competition-related rules for infringement remedies with respect to SEPs, and it addressed both patent holdup and holdout as possibilities for distorting FRAND negotiations. The DOJ, Jeff Wilder, I know he spoke, I believe, yesterday, has provided some views on that. But I would like to focus in my time particularly on the FTC and where the FTC may be going with this. David already kind of pointed to the FTC as, the spearhead, the tip of the spear on many of these SEP and FRAND issues, and I think they are quite poised to take on that role again. So I want to draw your attention to a recent speech by FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter titled SEPs Antitrust and the FTC. Notably, the speech never mentioned the Qualcomm case. So sort of it totally sort of walled that off because what it is focusing on is the idea that, and what she said is the FTC has been correct in bringing SEP-related enforcement actions against anti-competitive conduct using its standalone Section 5 authority. Now, you may recall in the Qualcomm complaint, there was actually a Section 5 standalone allegation. It really didn't get much play. The case was really litigated under the Sherman Act Section 2 standard. But what she says is the FTC should continue to do so with an emphasis on our authority to reach conduct beyond that which violates Section 2 of the Sherman Act. This is consistent with the policy statement the Commission issued in July regarding unfair methods of competition. So just to give you a little more insight on what that is. So the FTC has authority to police unfair methods of competition. It has, over time, and the courts have recognized this, sort of incorporation by reference. Anything that violates the Sherman Act is a violation of Section 5 of the FTC Act. And there's been pretty much, one-to-one overlap between what's an unfair method of competition and what's a Sherman Act or Clayton Act violation. The one area where unfair methods of competition kind of has been accepted as going beyond the Sherman Act is invitations to collude. Because the Sherman Act requires a contract, combination, or conspiracy, it doesn't cover offers to collude. So the FTC has used unfair methods of competition to kind of fill that gap. At times in the past, going back to the 70s, the FTC tried to use unfair methods of competition more broadly. And it was an abject failure every time. It lost four cases and kind of abandoned trying to do that. But there has always been this interest kind of percolating through with the idea that, well, it means unfair methods of competition must mean something. And when it was given to the FTC at the creation of the FTC 100 years ago, the legislative history suggested UMC was supposed to be beyond the current boundaries of the Sherman Act. So there's always been this question of, okay, well, what's beyond the current boundaries and what isn't? And I have a paper on, the boundaries of the Sherman Act changed enormously from 1914 to today, and is the FTC unfair method of competition always supposed to be beyond the fence of Section 2, no matter how broad Section 2 may be at the time? So the FTC in 2015 adopted a policy statement. This was during the Obama administration. That gave some context, some contours and limits to what unfair methods of competition would be. And it lined it up very much with the Sherman Act. It had a rule of reason approach, a consumer welfare standard, and kind of tried to tightly cabinet. I objected at the time because I didn't feel that it had been well developed enough. I didn't have any objections to the underlying principles, but I thought that the policy statement, which was rather brief, really needed to be bigger and to have undergone some more input from the public. Anyway, so what Becca Slaughter is referring to is that just this summer, the FTC new majority rescinded that policy statement. So they essentially said, we're not going to be subject to even those kinds of limits on what unfair methods of competition will be. We think Congress gave the FTC a much broader mission. So with that understanding, that is what Becca Slaughter is talking about. She's talking about using not Section 2 of the Sherman Act, but unfair methods of competition to police SEP-related enforcement. A few other things that she said is, holdup is a serious problem and especially disadvantages smaller and medium-sized implementers. So that's kind of, I think, one of the new tacks, one of the new concerns here. Oh, well, big players can take care of themselves. What we're really worried about is the little guy. And, so this idea that, well, Sherman Act, that's for the big players. FTC, unfair methods of competition, is going to protect the little guy. She argues that there's evident or abundant data that holdup exists. She also says holdout is not as big of an issue from a competition standpoint. And so, again, we're seeing this movement away from this, I think, more balanced recognition that you could have opportunistic conduct on either side of the table, to just saying, well, no, hold out, that it doesn't really happen. It's hold up that we need to be concerned about. So one of the things that she talks about is one way to accomplish, a better outcome is with clearer FRAND policies that facilitate licensing. And more of a focus on SDO FRAND policies. And she also says contract law may not be enough, and we should not foreclose an entire body of law, antitrust law, when we find conduct that results in competitive harm. So So we kind of see I think the new arguments, which is, okay, Sherman Act, that's for the big guys, but there's still these problems, small and medium-sized implementers. Hold up is the problem, not hold out. So the question then becomes, well, how are they going to implement that? What are they going to do to kind of move around the Qualcomm decision, sort of sidestep that, because obviously that kind of shut off the Sherman Act approach, is another thing that the FTC has talked a lot about, and the current chair is quite a fan of, is the FTC using its rulemaking authority under unfair methods of competition to implement rules. So the FTC, in the FTC Act, initially wasn't really given rulemaking authority. There was a kind of an oddball little section apart from where its major powers were given and its major enforcement, administrative litigation structure was laid out, that the FTC was also given the power to make some rules. And it had been, for many, many years, interpreted as being just kind of internal process rules for the FTC, right? Not rules of general application to private parties in the economy. So, and the FTC for decades said, no, we don't, that doesn't give us, substantive rulemaking authority. Well, in the, I think it was in the 70s, I'm not quite sure when the rule was hatched, but it was considered in the 70s. It decided, wait, we do have substantive rulemaking authority, and it tried to promulgate a rule called the octane rule, which would require petroleum retailers to post an octane rating on the tank, on the pump. And it promulgated this as both an unfair method of competition and an unfair and deceptive act of practice. So unfair and deceptive act of practice is the FTC's Consumer Protection Authority that we're all familiar with. Fraud, false advertising, things like that. And so this rule got challenged, and the DC Circuit upheld the FTC's rulemaking authority, and it didn't really make much of a distinction between unfair and deceptive acts or practices or unfair methods of competition. It basically said it was kind of the full flower of expansive interpretation. The court essentially said, we like rulemaking, we think rulemaking is a good idea, and the statute doesn't say the FTC can't do it. So it kind of blessed this rule, which, by the way, was never enforced and was rescinded. So Congress reacts and gives the FTC rulemaking authority for unfair and deceptive acts or practices. Says nothing about unfair methods of competition. The FTC doesn't try to promulgate another unfair method of competition rule for the next 40 years. But the current chair, Lena Khan, believes that what that case stands for is that the FTC actually has substantive unfair methods of competition rulemaking authority. And she just, she has a talk about this. They've set up a new rulemaking group within the FTC's general counsel's office. Chair Khan just gave a speech at the OECD, I believe it was yesterday, extolling the virtues of rulemaking. So what I foresee is that the FTC is now going to try to pursue unfair methods of competition rulemaking, and likely in the SEP space. Possibly to promulgate some kind of rule that says, failure to, license a SEP on FRAND terms is an unfair method of competition, or seeking an injunction against a willing licensee is an unfair method of whatever its previous wishes and desires that it wasn't able to get through court, it will now try to get through rulemaking. And so what does that mean? So if it promulgates a rule, those subject to the rule would be, if they violate it, would be subject to civil penalties of, I think it's around $43,000 per violation. And just so you know, the way the FTC, at least in the consumer protection area, where its rulemaking authority is clear, has calculated per violation, sometimes as being per day, sometimes being for advertising, per advertisement that went out. So these penalties can stack up rather quickly. I do think that this is going to be sort of a new area for the FTC to explore. It's rather esoteric, because the FTC has really never done this kind of rulemaking, so we'll see what happens. And there's lots of areas it may want to do this. Non-competes is an area the FTC has identified. But given the signals that the FTC has sent, Becca Slaughter has sent, I think we need to be alert for sort of a round two of some of these theories to come through in rulemaking. So I know this panel is about global differences, but I will just say that what we saw globally in response to the FTC and some of the DOJ's other previous actions, sort of giving cover, giving energy to some of the ideas of essential facilities doctrine or limiting the ability to assert patent rights on SEPs, I think we might see sort of a new round of sort of energy that reverberates globally towards saying, oh, well, this is the U.S.'s position, so ergo ours should also be accepted. So I will stop there on my esoteric FTC rulemaking discussion.
Thank you, Maureen. And this panel is about what you guys want to talk about, because I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts and David's thoughts on a lot of these pressing issues. Before we move into Q&A, and please, audience questions are welcome, and I'll integrate those into our discussion. Just a quick observation. David's your theme was really fragility, the fragility of the innovation system, and this sort of idea of standardization is a 30-year I wouldn't say experiment, but process in which it's created unprecedented levels of innovation. And so here we are at 5G, and there's kind of an underlying belief that, 6G is just in someone's basement. It's just going to come out regardless. I don't know. It just doesn't matter. It just kind of happens. It's inevitable, like Thanos in Avengers, the snap of a finger. But the reality is it's quite difficult, right? It takes a lot of resources and energy and coordination. And so, it reminds me of my time at the agency, and I'll keep it very broad and general, but there was discussions about licensing, and this was with not within the agency, it was outside, of device level licensing versus component level, and the need to separate the SEPs to license at each level. And one party's economist said, so what? Make them do it. And it's just the thought that there's no opportunity cost and transaction costs to these type of things. It's just kind of an attitude that things will just happen. We'll get the right result anyways. It's just about giving more rents to one group or another, when the reality is that how we structure those incentives really do matter in terms of innovation. And I think that's kind of a concern. Now, Maureen, your theme, which is really important, is the rulemaking, the agencies. The agencies after Qualcomm, I think, are changing. They're realizing that their arguments are not winning in the courts, and rather than accepting that, they're sort of changing how they approach antitrust, including Section 5 and rulemaking, and they've taken something that Section 5, I think, was reasonably a rule of reason approach, which the agency both bipartisan agreement that that's what it should be. They've changed that into something that's, I think, more of a administrative and regulatory type of tool, which I think is a concern rather than looking at, I think, was a very good opinion in Qualcomm. So with that, what I'm going to do is, like I said, I will integrate audience questions, but let me just start off, and I'll start with David. Are there sort of, talking about the global theme, are there best practices, principles that are universal that I think perhaps, or you think that all jurisdictions should adopt in terms of how we think of FRAND and SEPs, or really there really isn't a universal approach? Are there principles that we should follow regardless?
Well, yes, I think the basic principle at a very high level is that this global system of innovation needs to be protected. So I'll put it in terms of innovation first. Now, of course, you have innovation at multiple levels. Certainly, the implementers innovate, but if you don't have innovation upstream in what I call the enabling technology, there's nothing for other people to build on. So yes, Apple is a very important downstream innovator, but unless someone comes up with 5G and 6G, then they're going to run out of steam real fast. So the amazing thing here is that the implementers really depend on somebody else building the enabling technology. But at the same time, if you don't have a functioning system, you won't get it. So it's exactly what you said, that people take for granted that another wave of enabling technology is just going to come along. Well, billions of dollars have to be spent in R&D over 5 to 10 to 15-year periods to make this happen. And I'm just constantly shocked by the antitrust agency's deep ignorance of how this system works. And what Maureen was saying about the FTC, I mean, they're just in it to win political marks for themselves. It's an agency at war with itself. On the one hand, it says it's against big tech, but on the other hand, it's undermining the little guy in the name of the little guy. So the basic principle here is please take a systems view of the world. That's the best practice. Look beyond your silo of what you think is your own professional knowledge. If you're going to fiddle with this stuff, make sure you read the international business literature. Make sure you read the literature on strategic alliances. Make sure you understand complex systems before you sit around, and as you pointed out yourself, a casual remark about let's make them do this. It's just feeble minds at work that have not bothered to invest in understanding complex business organization. And in so doing, they sell not the consumer, but nation states and economic welfare and innovation down the stream. So I'm really just almost at my wit's end with how our government agencies, champions supposedly of the small guy and champions of innovation and champions of the consumer, do things directly contrary to what their stated goals are because their lack of understanding of complex systems.
Thank you, David. Maureen, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so during the debates when I was at the FTC, one of the things that bugged me is this argument that our belief in the value and the importance of IP rights was faith-based. There was no evidence for it. So I took that as a little bit of a challenge and actually did a big survey, and some of you might be aware of this. It was published as an article looking, is there evidence? Is there a way to see? And what I looked at was as IP laws change, right? So we do have natural experiments over time. And it's hard to measure innovation directly. So I used investments in R&D as a proxy, and it's not perfect. And you can't show causation, it's more correlation. I've therefore exhausted my economic knowledge, But anyway, there did seem to be a correlation over time across the world as IP rights were either strengthened or weakened, investment in R&D rose in a similar fashion. It was more evident in some industries than others. Pharma is a big example, medical devices, but it was present in all of the industries that I looked at. So I do think that where you draw the lines, it's kind of ridiculous to just have the view, oh, no, all these great things will happen regardless of incentives. I don't know what in the history of the world would suggest that that's the case. But anyway, to the extent that the question is there proof that IP rights can have this impact on innovation? I'm not saying this article is definitive, but to my mind, it did suggest there is, something to that claim.
Aurelian?
Yeah. Hi, Aurelian Portuguese from the Schumpeter Project on Competition Policy at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. Thank you for this great panel. A very, very interesting thought. As it has been said by David and Maureen, we see a shift from the focus on hold up to hold out and back from hold out to hold up, even though there is no so much of evidence on hold up, and there is a lot of evidence on hold out, as it has been said yesterday during this conference. So it's interesting to see that there's this agency focus even though there's a lack of evidence. And as you said, Maureen, we expect that through Section 5, and we know it's going to happen in the next few weeks or in the next few months, that now the FTC commission is full with all the commissioners nominated. So the question is, this shift from ex-post antitrust enforcement to a more ex-ante regulatory regime, don't you think that this illustrates a more precautionary approach so that we approach innovation and disruptions and also innovation capabilities in a more precautionary approach, so that you just regulate even before the companies can build their innovation capabilities? And more broadly, perhaps my question is, more fundamentally, this tells us something about our view of capitalism. Isn't this shift from the agencies, and particularly to the FTC, this idea of open markets, the open market, open source, that any sort of property right is a closure of market, and this idea of making everything open, so that you force for open market, which I may consider as being the very contrary of free markets. And we see all these tensions that we can talk about that in very technical terms, but I think there's a more philosophical, economic discussions that we need to have about this shift from ex-post antitrust enforcement to an ex-ante precautionary approach, and also this idea of open markets everywhere, which is the contrary to free market, where we truly and duly respect property right, including, of course, intellectual property right. Do you think that we can engage in these wider discussions? Yeah.
I mean, I think that's clearly true. I think the progressive view is, like, they've essentially said they don't think antitrust has worked, and they think that there needs to be more direct intervention in markets. So I do think that that's clear. More of a view of designing markets, of saying, level playing fields or access, or, it's not just limited to IP, right? This is very broad view, versus the idea of being a referee, right? The idea that agencies aren't supposed to dictate market structure. They're supposed to call fouls. Mm-hmm. I mean, and sometimes we can have very useful economic research that may say a market might work better if, a regulatory approach was taken differently, or if there was more information in the marketplace, So I don't mean to say, like, well, totally, passive kind of view of you can't improve competition through inquiry and study, but I do think there is, this philosophical shift into, they talk about railroad-style regulation, right, for platforms, things like that. So obviously, everything old is new again, as Tim Mears once said.
Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions for you, Maureen. The first one, I wanted to continue sort of the chess game analysis strategy of what the FTC is doing. So they're blocked under the Sherman Act, as you observed. So they redefine their Section 5 authority to mean whatever the FTC says it means, which is pretty much literally what they say in their statement. And now they're going to go for rulemaking. But aren't they going to run into a roadblock with AMG Capital Management? That was an ambiguous area in the statute, and we had a unanimous Supreme Court strike that down, that if they don't clearly have powers, they don't have those powers. My second question, which is a little provocative, is under current FTC leadership, is there a serious reason to believe that they would weigh fairly the full economic literature bearing on any particular policy point?
So on your first question, I actually have a paper that I co-authored with Jim Rill, looking at the FTC's claim of UMC rulemaking authority and kind of trying to bring a more modern statutory analysis to it. And yes, it's absolutely right. When you look at the AMG decision, a unanimous Supreme Court said, we're not going to sort of put things in the statute that we don't think are there, and they paid very careful attention to the language. They also paid very careful attention to the placement within the statute. So I think that certainly brings to mind the challenges of this broad interpretation of UMC rulemaking authority. But the issue there also is, so when you looked at the AMG case, when I started at the FTC, my first dissent that I wrote, which is in the summer of 2012, was when the FTC rescinded the disgorgement policy statement. And then I proceeded to write various dissents about warning that the FTC was overusing this power, that it didn't have the authority, that it was inviting something like this to happen. But, you know, what did that take? 8 years, right? For it to, or so for it to come, or 9 years for that to come to pass. So there's a lot that can be done till something actually gets kind of wrestled to the ground. Now, on the FTC leadership, now, I mean, one other thing that I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention in my remarks is they have been raising concerns a lot about their lack of resources and their lack of enforcement resources. So while they could certainly try to bring a UMC enforcement action, that's rather resource intensive. So I think they see rulemaking as a way to kind of reduce the resource issue. One of the other things that they've talked about is having, or others, you know, has been in the debate, I'll put it that way, I don't know if I can tie it specific words to a specific commissioner, but kind of in this broader debate is the idea that bringing an enforcement action is too difficult, and part of the difficulty is the high standard that the economic evidence demands, the economic standard demands. So to the extent that they want to say their problems are evident, we don't, and you know, we're just held to too high a standard to prove anything in court, I think that also suggests kind of a de-emphasizing some of the economics.
Thank you.
Just to comment on the economics just briefly, you know, to me, I think there is some clear movement in doing that, in the sense that the leadership has also supported legislative actions to undermine the modern antitrust standard. And so to me, it's clear that that's the approach they're taking. And, you know, I think the economics becomes the boogeyman in a lot of these rule of reason cases, in that it weighs it down, it makes it unadministrable, it's asking for evidence that's unavailable, and you can't get anything done. Well, the fact that cases are difficult, I think, is the fact that these are difficult cases, and these are complex industries and markets. And so the idea that we have to take some time to understand them to get a decision right, I think, is overstating the cost to society. I think it's quite beneficial to society to engage in that exercise. And evidence is evidence, whether you call it economics or not, and sometimes that's difficult, and it takes resources. But I think that's a good thing, ultimately, rather than a bad thing. So it's a weird characterization of evidence-based economics. But with that, David, I wanted to ask you a question about this intersection of IP and antitrust. There's clearly a movement to, and Maureen, you've touched on this, of sharing data, interoperability between networks and platforms, interconnection, and clearly they're playing on something that we consider good, right? The fact that we can use Microsoft Office on a Mac or a PC. You know, we all identify with interconnection and the convenience that provides. But as a regulatory system, as a sort of requirement, is quite different from a voluntary transaction to be interoperable. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts on that movement and the interplay with IP.
Yes, and of course you're right. Interoperability is a good thing and fosters competition, and compatibility standards are important. And this is where you have to distinguish between what I call standard setting and standards development. A lot of people have taken standards development organizations and just assumed that what they do is, discuss compatibility standards and agree upon compatibility standards. But that's not what's going on at all. It's more a standards development. And by standards development, I don't mean just creating compatibility. I mean, building the technologies in the first place that you want to make compatible. And so there has been a confusion, and a lot of people have, and this is why I think they've underestimated the importance and misunderstood the fragility of the standards development system. It's not just about compatibility. That's certainly a great side benefit. It's really about supporting the technologies of the future. So I'll leave it at that point for the moment.
Thank you. Maureen, did you have any thoughts on that?
I do. So a lot of this debate, and this is, I think, further afield than just the IP issues we may be discussing, does have this idea that, and I think Aurelian touched on openness. All openness is good. More open, the better, right? And sort of put aside, incentives. Also put aside for the idea of like data sharing and then some interoperability. We're seeing that in some of the proposed platform-focused legislation. And it's one thing if the customer or the consumer decides, so I want to be able to port my data out and share it more freely, reduce switching costs or something else. That could be beneficial, right? That could be beneficial to competition. And a lot of tech companies actually are already part of a consortium to try to be able to allow that to happen. One of my concerns, because I also, as a former privacy enforcer and current privacy practitioner, wonder how that comports with consumer privacy rights, right? I gave my data to one company, and now antitrust is saying, well, every other company has to get it too, right? I think that raises some real tensions. I have an article called Privacy and Competition, Friends, Foes, or Frenemies. And sometimes they're foes, right? And I also think on the interoperability requirements, that also raises some data security kinds of issues. We spent a lot of time on the consumer protection side telling companies, be careful about who gets access to your systems and your data and things like that. And now we're kind of taking that and flipping it on its head and saying you have to give free access. And if you guess wrong, if you're not narrowly tailored enough, if you deny access, you're subject to, quite crushing fines. One other thing, if this goes far enough, I think there are some takings issues too. That you might have a regulatory taking kind of claim if you are now required to share your IP, share your data, share your facilities, with really all comers in some versions of these bills. So.
Yeah, it just seems like an overall weakening of what we consider IP rights and what they are, which is fundamentally property rights. And so it just feels like it's putting it in a different category where there's a recognition you should get a reward, but we'll determine what's enough and not too much. And then we'll bring it over to the implementers and give them a return as well. It just seems like there's a lot of, as Aurelian said, sort of an ex-ante approach to how we view intellectual property rights in this realm, which is a big surprise. So I thought I would move to this case, Continental Automotive Systems versus Avanci and Nokia. And honestly, this room probably knows more about that case than I do, but just to tee it up briefly for those who are unfamiliar with this is a case that's spanning jurisdictions. I think it's in Germany and the US. And Continental is an input supplier to automakers. And so they use telecom IP and technology into their inputs that they sell to automakers like Daimler. And so the question, similar to Qualcomm, is at what level are the Nokias and the Qualcomms of the world required under FRAND to license? Can they license it directly to automakers, the device level, if you will? Or does Continental have that right at the component level to receive licensing? And if so, what should that rate be? And additionally, with Avanci, which is sort of a consortium of a pool of patents where they're bringing together various technologies and facilitating the licensing through lowering transaction costs, almost like BMI and CBS, does that invoke Section 1 type of issues? And so I know there's a lot there, and I'm just wondering if you had any thoughts on that case and whether Qualcomm really does sort of answer that case for us broadly. But I know it's a complex case, so I'm not doing it justice. But Maureen, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that case.
No, I think it's a very, very interesting case. First, the standing, right, that got thrown out on Continental got thrown out on the lack of antitrust standing. But then secondly, the court did assess the merits and, looked at this idea that Section 1 is about concerted action, but the plaintiff admitted in the complaint that, so this involved this Avanci patent pool, that they were able to license collectively through Avanci or in parallel through each of the individual patentees, so that didn't find a claim there. And then this is the interesting part when I wanted to go in. Well, all of it is interesting, but one that I found kind of interesting is regarding the Section 2 claim. The district court found that the use of deception simply to obtain higher prices normally has no particular tendency to exclude rivals and thus to diminish competition. And I think that is very, very interesting because I think sometimes the idea that, so I think back to some of the FTC cases that Tim Uris brought, Unical in particular, where, and you talk about fraud on the patent office, things like that, but there's a fine distinction there, and that I think is an important one, which is whether you use that deception to gain your market power, right? Did you deceive the patent office to get a patent, or did you deceive the, California Air Resources Board to adopt the standard where you said, oh, I don't have any IP on that. They adopt the standard, aha, I have got the IP and you all have to pay me. Was the deception the way you gained market power? And I think that's a really important kind of thing, rather than, is there really just a dispute about what an appropriate FRAND fee is? And if you say, well, it's too high, it's deceptive, it's an antitrust violation, I think that, is kind of a different idea than deception that gets you the market power.
David, did you have any thoughts on that case?
No, I don't know the case. I'll pass.
Fair enough. So, the prior panel discussed the intersection of SEPs in China, and it was a very important discussion, and it's so important that I thought I would just kind of ask if you had any thoughts as well. So, David, I don't know if that's a topic that you're wanting to comment on, but I thought I'd throw it out and give you an opportunity in case.
Well, one thing I do note about China is that most licensors have sort of been forced into a position where there's, quote, a China price, which is lower than what other people pay. And that's because, the Chinese companies have been classic cases of holdout. They've taken full advantage of the technologies developed outside of China. And the courts have been reluctant to use injunctive powers. And as a consequence, you now have a sort of almost a two-tier global system where there's one rate for China and one rate for the rest of the world. And to me, it shows what happens when you take away the power to enjoin, because if you have to chase each one of these companies around the world and get them in court to get them to pay, is obviously very costly. So on the one hand, China's come a long way in terms of intellectual property. They do recognize that, innovation is the most important thing. But at the same time, they have not been even-handed in the way they enforce intellectual property. And so it's not really a rule of law in the sense of everybody having equal treatment. In general, I don't think China has anything to bring to the rest of the world that is worth imitating. And as I've said earlier, they're involved in the standard setting process in a very coordinated, strategic way. So that's potentially a major issue. As I've said, there's a number of enemies of the global open system. One is the FTC, and it's really sad for me to hear they're having another go at it. But probably the bigger one is strategic behavior from China.
Thank you, Dave. Maureen, did you have any thoughts on the state of IP in China?
I mean, the only thing that I completely agree with everything that David said is don't underestimate the influence or the confounding factor that when you have a lot of these companies who are also state-owned enterprises, right? So that also ties the sort of the government approach very closely to some, to the benefit of certain players there.
Well, I'm going to go to an online question, and this is directed to you, David. You say FRAND is a range. How wide can that be, and what factors allow that? Is royalty-free FRAND, or is royalty-free a separate category?
Well, I think royalty-free is a separate category, but FRAND is a range depending somewhat on what's in the portfolio and who are the parties. I don't think it's 0 to infinity range, but it's a range that's set by industry practice and by the identity of the parties and the technologies. So there is no formula for FRAND, and I think it has to be a range to accommodate different circumstances, and part of that different circumstance is what I call getting the licensing program started. There's a so-called early bird special. If you're the first to take a license, or amongst the first to take a license, you can expect a somewhat better price than someone who comes later, because licensing is or patent licensing is like pushing on a string, particularly as the courts take away injunctive powers. There's not much of a stick that the patent owner has to move the process along. So a discount is one thing. So there's many reasons for accommodating a certain amount of heterogeneity. And it's also, as you think about the D aspect, the discriminatory aspect, you have to recognize that not everybody is similarly situated. So you can have different license rates for different strategic groups and for different use cases. In my view, it makes economic sense to have it that way. And I believe when you look at the real world, you do see it that way in many cases.
Thank you, David. One of the themes of your talk earlier was this difference between damages and injunction, and how obviously they are not equivalent. I mean, it's very simple. Which one would you prefer? If you're an innovator, you would take the injunction. It gives you significantly more property rights based off of that. And so a question I have for both of you is, in designing how we should view the scope of your property right within SEPs and FRAND, how does that interplay, certainly if that's going to be an antitrust violation in some instances, with the optimal design of IP law itself and contract law? And to me, these are three endogenous sort of laws that play together, and so moving and increasing antitrust enforcement is going to influence, and I think perhaps in a negative way, how those other laws are being administered and sort of the optimal balance of rights in those areas. And so I don't know if you had any thoughts on the interplay of those three laws and how increasing antitrust enforcement, certainly as the FTC is ramping up, can interfere with those other areas of the law. Maureen, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, these discussions remind me of many years ago when I was a young lawyer, and my first clerkship was at the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And then my second job was I was staff attorney at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and then eventually a law clerk. But when I started as staff attorney, my paperwork got all messed up. And I didn't get paid for 6 weeks. And I had a young family, and my boss said to me, well, you're going to get paid eventually. And I said, how do I take that to the grocery store and buy food for my family, right? So this idea that, well, it doesn't matter how long the holdout happens because down the road, you're eventually going to get paid. That always made me think of that, like that, how do you keep the lights on? How do you, and maybe you say, okay, you got a big company, right? They don't need to worry about that, right? They can pull from other areas. But like fundamentally, that's not an answer we would accept in other areas, right? I mean, if you are using, somebody's IP, you're supposed to be paying for it, and say for 5 years, you don't. I mean, I don't think that saying, well, at the end of that 5 years, you're going to get what you should have been paid at the beginning of the 5 years or along the way is really a sufficient answer. So that always bothered me about taking injunctions off the table. And look, the eBay standard, so I mentioned, look, I worked in the federal court system for 5 years. They weren't handing out injunctions willy-nilly, right? An injunction is pretty hard to get, and they would have to show that money damages wasn't sufficient. So I'm not sure that goes quite to your question, but I mean, that was the thing that I always looked at. It was like, well, it seems like the courts aren't, I mean, particularly post-eBay, are not just sort of wildly giving out injunctions. So to me, that balance seemed to be out of whack when people were saying, oh, it doesn't matter, you don't need an injunction because you'll get paid eventually. So.
David, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I do. And just to build on what Maureen says, of course, if you ultimately get damages or have the expectation of damages, of course, the ones that are hurt the most by that are the small players that are less well financed. But the bigger effect is the knock-on effect, because if one licensee or one putative licensee sees another one not paying, it just leads to a bandwagon effect and leads to an unraveling of the whole system. And the collapse of the system. So you can't look at these things one at a time. You've got to look at the knock-on effects, and they're tragic. I mean, it really destroys the market for know-how. It really destroys the licensing market and puts everything into the courtroom. So it is very frustrating for me to hear people make those arguments because they're clearly not thinking in a more broad-based way about what you need to make markets work.
Thank you, David. And did you have a question? No, just stretching. Fair enough. Aurelian?
Just a question on this very discussion about efficient infringement, because yesterday there was this discussion with the paper from Jonathan Barnett and David Kapos. I think it's very interesting to see how it is rational to have this infringement, and the question for the law or the reform would be how to make it less rational. And I think the number of criteria that have been determined in Jonathan's and David's papers are interesting, but also, why not all companies infringe? Because some respect, right? And one perhaps intuitions may be that they care about their reputation. So how can perhaps we can disincentivize efficient infringement by the number of criteria that have been just making efficient infringement less rational, but also by increasing reputational cost. And that could be potentially an idea for agencies to say that efficient infringement shouldn't be rational to wait for 5 years. And of course, that makes a lot of sense economically. So there should be injunctions earlier, but also there should be perhaps increased reputational cost so that the infringement on the first place is fully deterred. Do you think that could be I don't know, it's just a general question. What about the reputational costs, like name and shame solutions at the top of these injunctive reliefs, more intervening more timely?
I could see that happening more in sort of the public sphere, but not necessarily the governmental sphere, because I'm always cautious. So one of the things that I always like to be careful about when I was in the government is what authority has been given to the agency from Congress, and are we providing due process? Are we being, sort of fair players in that? So I would just worry that name and shame could be used in ways that were, and I'm perhaps now are being used in ways that I think are inappropriate, right? That, you know, the idea that a government agency, at least the FTC, you know, it has authority over unfair methods of competition and unfair and deceptive actor practices. It's not authority over moral decisions. It's not authority over, you know, other types of values. And so even if I might have sympathy in some ways, I'm worried about sort of how that may be deployed in other ways.
David?
Yes, I'm sorry I missed the panel on efficient infringement. I actually have thought a little bit about this, and really, you know, this idea of efficient breach, which, you know, comes from the world of contracts, it comes from the world of tangible capital, not the world of intangibles. And in fact, I think it's completely backwards. I think what some people are calling efficient infringement is actually dynamically inefficient infringement, because, you know, patents are not self-enforcing, and if you undermine the system even further, you undermine the innovation system itself. So I think it's really the misapplication of a theory from contract law over from the world of tangibles to the world of intangibles. And I think it's time for people to recognize that anything that sort of delays the payment of royalties hurts the innovation process, or at least it hurts the open innovation process. We should recognize, and I heard Jonathan Barnett's voice before, that there are alternatives here. If you kill the licensing model, there's another model, which is the vertical integration model, and large companies benefit from that. So the FTC seems to have almost no clue that when they go after the licensing model, what they're really doing is favoring the vertical integration model. Large companies that have got complementary assets can do okay if you weaken the IP system. So that's what I said earlier about the FTC as an agency at war with itself, because on the one hand, it'd like to be a champion of the little guy, but the policies it's articulating here, or the tendencies it's demonstrating, are ones that favor larger enterprises that don't need to rely on licensing as a way to capture value from technology. And if that basic point could be better understood, and Jonathan Barnett's new book does an excellent job of outlining that, then I think we'd end up with better policy.
Thank you, David. We have a question?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, David, Maureen, and John, for your excellent presentations. It's good to see you again. It's really an observation. I think both in this panel and a prior panel yesterday, as I recall, folks have described the Chinese approach to licensing as state ownership. Actually, most of the high-tech companies are not state-owned. ZTE is state-owned. Huawei, we can argue about it, but arguably is not. Huawei seems to get the brunt of our attention these days, not ZTE. Qualcomm has an investment in Xiaomi, as I recall, is fairly significant, along with others. And this conflates a more important issue, or disguises a more important issue, which is state-directed activity, which is state-directed pricing and the like. And we've seen this where some of our agencies, like CFIUS, has finally recognized that it's not how much you own it or who owns it, it's who's controlling it that really matters to the US government. And I think the same thing should apply in the licensing context when we talk about what Chinese policies are. We really have to get to what China is doing overtly. In some cases, it's easier to say someone is state-owned or not state-owned, but more likely, as we discussed earlier, a lot of this is happening covertly. It's not open for everybody to observe, or we can only guess at what is happening internally. Going along with that, I'd just like to give a plug for a suggestion that Dave Kapos has also been helping me with. In the US, at our patent registry, if you file a patent and you've benefited from US government assistance, you have to disclose under the Bayh-Dole Act that this was funded by the US government for the R&D. No such requirement attaches if it was funded by a foreign government. So we've been trying to urge the USPTO to disclose foreign ownership or investment, which I think is really the critical issue here, whether the state overseas is directing the investment or directing the licensing practices. And I think we could do better in that regard. So I just think we should really deconstruct state ownership for a moment and really look at the bigger problem, which is state-directed activity. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really excellent point. Thank you.
Phil?
Is this thing on? Good. So I'd just like to try and offer a question, maybe wrapping things up, since I know time is sort of the essence here. And I'm thinking about actually the panel earlier today and some of the things we've been talking about the whole time and many of the things you've brought up. It seems like we're dealing with a bunch of colliding contradictions with one another, right? We have FTC, an organization at war with itself in a sense. We have, on the one hand, Chinese strategy and standard setting organizations in a position where, yeah, we'd really like to be in a position to hold up if we wanted to, whereas domestically we have in China a situation where it's all about making sure the input factors are all right and we're looking for the little guy. So I guess my question would be, what sort of contradiction paradox do you think we should address first, and how might we go about doing that? Is it an element of, well, we say it's collaboration in these standard setting organizations, but we are moving toward more of a winners take all view? Is it a situation in which, well, we first got to get our own house straight, figure out what the FTC is all about, and move forward that way? What would be the main, not to be too Marxist here, not to be too Xi Jinping, but would be the main contradiction that we need to resolve?
David, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, well, I'm of the view that the way that we bring about alignment, because you're right, there's contradictions everywhere, is if we adopt this approach, what I call dynamic competition, that, you know, what our agencies have been pushing unwittingly, I think is what I call a static notion of competition that doesn't pay attention to innovation. If we in the United States don't put innovation first, we're going to lose not just national competitiveness and national security, we're going to lose democracy as well. That we're in a battle now, a strategic rivalry on steroids, and the very, you know, survival of our democracies, of Western democracies, depends on maintaining leadership in technology. In which case, you know, whether you're talking industrial policy, whether you're talking technology policy, whether you're talking competition policy, we have to have an innovation-first approach. That's the way that we can resolve these contradictions. And I believe there is a way to do that by adopting what I call this dynamic competition framework, which needs to be more fully developed, which says that the primary driver of competition is innovation. The agencies have done a great job of recognizing that competition is important for innovation, and I accept that. But it also goes the other way. Innovation is a key driver of competition. If you had that lens on all of these issues, these antitrust issues, I think you'd have convergence between IP and antitrust. I think you'd have convergence around industrial policy and technology policy questions. And, you know, I dream that we're actually inching our way in that direction, but we're doing it in such a clumsy and slow way that I'm also afraid we'll never get there.
Thank you, David. Maureen?
I don't think I could add anything to that. That was so well put.
No, I think that's a great way to close. We're actually at time. So with that, please join me in thanking David and Maureen for our discussion.